Hi, my name is Emily Herring, and I'd like to thank you for joining us to learn about evergreens. Evergreen trees are something that's popular right now because it's Christmas time. And when I think about my knowledge of evergreen trees, it started when I was a little kid and we'd go Christmas tree shopping every year. It's a tradition that my family had, and it has passed on to my family. I take my children Christmas tree shopping, and it's something that I enjoy, and it's very much a part of my holiday season. Now, when I was in high school, and maybe it was even in college, my mom and myself, and then it was always my uncles, would go Christmas tree shopping. And we would spend hours in the Christmas tree farms finding the perfect tree. And we found this beautiful tree, and we brought it home, and my dad would always help us set it up. Usually lots of grumblings from him about setting up a crooked tree. And we were setting this tree up, and he's like, my goodness, this is so pokey. And we always like to purchase firs, and we thought this was a fir, but quickly recognized the fact that it wasn't a fir, it was actually a spruce. And I think then I realized I didn't know really much about evergreens, and it wasn't until I started school at Iowa State and took dendrology class, so learned trees at Iowa State, that I learned truly how many different species of evergreens we have here in the United States, and the different types of evergreens that we plant here in Iowa. Out here at the Grimes Farm, I found at least 11 different evergreen species that I'm going to teach you a little bit about. And then I'm also going to teach you about conifers. And we'll talk about those terms here at the very beginning to clarify what the difference is, because we use them interchangeably, but they actually aren't interchangeable. So, to start off, first and foremost, when we talk about evergreen trees, commonly we think of pines, spruces, cedars, firs, things like that. And those are evergreen trees. An evergreen is technically a tree that holds on to its needles for more than one season. So here in Iowa, for example, the white pine, it holds on to its needles for 2 years. So if you've ever been in an area that has white pine, you'll notice on the ground pretty much covered in pine needles. And that's because they lose their needles fairly quickly. It's a very short, they hold on to their needles for a short period of time compared to some other species. On average here in Iowa, evergreens hold on to their needles 2 to 7 years. Now, when you look at some species in the United States, like the bristlecone pine, they've been known to hold their needles for up to 50 years. So they can hold on to their needles for a long period of time. Now, evergreen trees hold on to their needles for specific reasons. It is an adaptation that helps them to be able to survive. We look at our forests now in the month of December, and we see very few leaves on our trees. The only thing that has leaves are the evergreens. Now, if we were to go out on a cold day and we were to test whether or not a tree was doing photosynthesis, we would look at the deciduous tree, the tree that's lost its leaves, and we could test also an evergreen tree, and we would find that there's actually very little difference in the type of energy that's being produced in those two trees. In fact, the reason why an evergreen holds onto its needles isn't so that way it can still keep growing and developing and making energy in the winter months. It's to help preserve energy throughout the year. So every time a deciduous tree puts on new leaves, it uses a bunch of energy to be able to create new leaves. However, on the other hand, an evergreen doesn't create new leaves every single year, so it doesn't have to produce a ton of energy. So what that means is that the tree, an evergreen tree, is actually holding on to its needles, so it doesn't have to regrow needles, and it saves energy that way. Now, this is kind of interesting to think about, because when we, I always thought that originally it was because they wanted to produce energy in the wintertime. Well, if that's true, when we look at like a tree cookie, we would see a different pattern in growth rings from an evergreen versus a hardwood or a deciduous tree. So there's definitely, the growth still slows down in the wintertime. It's not doing as much photosynthesis, but the whole point is so that way it doesn't have to grow new needles. Now, like the bristlecone pine that I talked about beforehand, they have to hold on to their needles for a long period, 30 years, 40, 50 years, to be able to drop those needles and grow new ones because of where they live and how much energy it takes to build new needles. So they live up in these dry, arid, high altitude mountainous areas, and they don't have a long growth season. They don't get a lot of warmth. They don't get a lot of sunlight. They're really just a lot of moisture. It's very, very harsh climate. And so for them to be able to lose their leaves and still be able to survive, they need that long a period to hold on to the needles that they make. Now, I'll use leaves and needles interchangeably throughout this conversation because needles are just a modified form of a leaf. They don't look like an oak leaf or a maple leaf that we think of, but in all honesty, they are just a form of a leaf. They have a waxy outer coating on it, which helps them with moisture retention, but they are just a form of modified leaf. They're also a little bit more complex, and so it takes more energy for a tree to make needles than it does for a deciduous tree like an oak to make their leaves. So another reason why they help to conserve energy that way. Now, when we look at places like the Rocky Mountains or the Sierra Nevadas, those rocky places, their harsh climates, high altitude, short growing season, there's a reason why they're dominated by conifers or pine trees or evergreen trees, and that is because they hold on to their needles longer, whereas deciduous trees just wouldn't be able to survive in those climates because of the energy process. So when we look at evergreen trees, that's one thing we can recognize is that they're doing this to help them to be able to survive and to be able to grow. Now, when we talk about evergreen versus conifers, this is where it gets a little confusing. An evergreen has to hold on to its leaves for more than one season. A conifer, on the other hand, is a plant that reproduces using a cone. And we will look at some cones here in just a little bit because they are very different compared to different types of species. It's also a great way to be able to identify different species because some species look a lot alike and their cones are the keys to being able to know what you're looking at. So conifers reproduce with a cone. Now, not all evergreens have cones, so not all evergreens are conifers, and not all conifers hold on to their leaves for more than one season. So we can't technically use those two words back and forth as the same thing, which I know I've been guilty with in the past. And so it's really interesting to me when I do segments like this because I learn a lot as well as I do my research and learn more in depth about the different kind of plants and animals that live here in Iowa. So conifers, they have to have a cone to reproduce. Inside that cone is seeds, usually multiple seeds, and all different conifers have different looking cones and shapes and sizes. I call them cones, I don't call them pine cones because, well, a pine cone is a pine's cone, and I can't call a spruce cone a pine cone, although you'll probably catch me at some point in time in this video calling a spruce cone a pine cone because it's such a habit. But all different types of cones, so we have pine cones, spruce cones. There's actually fir cones, although they're very difficult to find. And so cedar cones, which don't really look like cones at all. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. Now, when I was talking about trees that are conifers that are not evergreens, those are species like ginkgos. Ginkgos are actually a conifer. They have a cone. However, they lose their leaves. They're a deciduous conifer. Another species is larch. So those species lose their leaves in the fall. However, they reproduce with a cone. When I look at evergreen trees, evergreens, so a lot of tropical areas have evergreens, but they don't have cones. Things like holly and mountain laurel, they reproduce using flowers and berries. And so they are evergreen, they don't lose their leaves, but they're not conifers because they don't have a cone. So cones, all shapes and sizes. And it's kind of fun to look at the different forms of evergreen different conifer cones. So to start with, I always like the wow factor. we're going to talk about this pine cone here. So if you've probably never ever found a pine cone like this here in Iowa, and that's because this tree does not grow in Iowa. This is from a sugar pine that grows out in the western part of the United States. It is the largest pine species. So there's other trees out west that are bigger, but they're not considered pines. And this is a true pine cone. So it is one of the largest species, and they can grow for a long period of time, grow for hundreds of years. It gets its name because of the sap. So when they log this tree, they find that the sap has a very sweet flavor to it. And it was used as food as somewhat, a little bit, but there is one catch with that sweet sap. It is a laxative. So they don't use it a lot for food. So it has a sweet taste, but you don't actively eat it because, well, you get yourself in trouble. So this is a sugar pine, and this is a normal sized pine cone. Now, pine cone structures we'll talk about, and it's easy to see with this one because it is so large. So this is where the pine cone obviously will attach to the base of the tree. These each individual woody structures are scales. This is the female cone. There are male cones and female cones. Sometimes they're on the same tree, sometimes they're not. But this is the female. Female cones tend to be larger, of course, then they carry the seed. And then if this still had seeds in it, which actually there are a couple in here. I don't know if I can get them out. So the pine cone seed is actually in each one of these spots. There's usually 2 of them or so in each scale. Okay, so in each of those scale, you'll find it's winged, and then there'll be a small seed attached to it. And this one doesn't have the seed attached anymore, and I don't know if any of them do. So then there'll be a small seed. So pines disperse via wind, which is really interesting. I don't know if a lot of us think about that when we see a pine cone on the ground, that they've already released a lot of their seeds via the wind. Now, when a pine cone is really interesting, you can take a pine cone, even one that you've had for years inside, put it in a glass of water, and it'll close back up. And the reason why it does that is because it's protecting its seed. If you are a plant that spreads your seeds via wind, you aren't going to spread your seeds very well when you're wet and they sink down to the ground, and then they fall right below the pine tree and they don't get enough sunlight to be able to regenerate. So what they'll do is they'll actually close up their cone when they're wet, so that way they are able to protect their seed, and then when it gets warm and dry again, they open back up. So if you want to do that experiment at home, just get a glass of warm water, put a pine cone in it. Within 5-10 minutes, that cone will close up. Put it back out on your sunny windowsill, and in a couple of days it'll dry out and open back up. It's a way of protecting future generations. So this is a sugar pine. One of the most common pine cones we find here in Iowa is this, and this is a eastern white pine. So eastern white pine species, we'll talk about a little bit more on how to identify it and things like that, but it is one of our native tree species here in Iowa. It's slightly curved, still has the same form, obviously different shaped, different size, but it has scales, and in each of these scales it holds its seed. Now, eastern white pine found up in the northern and eastern part of the United States. They're not found naturally throughout the state of Iowa. We grow them throughout the state of Iowa, but they're not found naturally through the state of Iowa. They're only kind of found up in the northeast corner, and then there's a couple outlying spots in the north central part of Iowa. Now, this is a western white pine, so these are 2 different species, and the western white pine cones can get quite a bit larger, and the trees themselves get quite a bit larger as well. Now, eastern white pines, they were known for masts for ships, and then the western white pine was actually the preferred species for matches at one point in time. We don't use matches a lot anymore, so they're not as preferred, I guess, at this point in time. Now, when we find these cones, this is not a pine cone. I mean, it looks like a pine cone, right? But it's a different form, shape. There's more scales, more compact, tight together, and this is actually a spruce cone. So it's a different species. This is a Norway spruce. We'll talk about how to identify spruce trees a little later. And spruce trees are hard to identify. The best way to identify them is actually using their cones. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But you can see that the scales on this are much more dense than with like the white pine cone. So you can see they're just definitely a different species there. Now, one of the trees that we have planted here in Iowa, although it's not super common, is the Douglas fir. Now, this is actually not a fir tree. Well, good old dendrology and nature always throws tricks at you. We call this a Douglas fir, but it's not a fir because its cone stays together. It actually has bracts on it, these little kind of spikes that stick up. And those spikes actually are a good way to identify a Douglas fir. A Douglas fir is what we call a false hemlock. So it's not a fir species, it's in its family of its own. Because when we do look at fir cones, they're really hard to find altogether. So a fir cone sits on the top of a branch and it's all together, and then when it is mature, it actually crumbles into lots of little pieces. So these are actually fir seeds, and they would all go together to make a cone shape that sits on the tree, but once it's mature, they shatter. This is really great food source for all different types of wildlife, but it is pretty hard to find a true fir cone all together because they shatter like this. And this is actually a balsam fir. I pulled this off of a Christmas tree that we picked last year for making wreaths out here at the Nature Center, and they had a bunch of these at the top, and they were already starting to shatter, but I collected a bunch of them to be able to show what a fir seed looks like versus pine cones and spruce cones. Now we have a couple of different firs that are grown here in Iowa. We don't have very many planted out here at the Grimes farm. Firs are a little harder to grow because they need a little bit more special soils, drainage, and so they're a little bit tougher to grow out here in Iowa and throughout the state. There is some native in the northeast corner of the state, but for the most part, they're harder to grow. We have them, though, growing in our Christmas tree farms. Lots of times people prefer fir trees. Fir trees are the preferred species of Christmas trees, soft needles. They hold onto their needles well. And commonly the two types of firs that we find for sale are balsam fir and Fraser firs. They are very hard to tell the difference. They're very similar, but Fraser firs come from the Appalachian Mountains in a small area versus balsam, which are found in the northeast part of the United States. Now, one of the other trees that I wanted to talk about being a conifer is a ginkgo. Now, ginkgos are deciduous, so they lose their leaves, but they still produce a cone. And the ginkgo female trees, there's male and female trees. Most of the time you find male trees because female trees, when they produce their seeds, smell absolutely horrible. They produce a peachish yellow colored seed, and it kind of looks like a plum almost. And that flesh on the outside of the seed smells horrible. But inside is a cone that holds the seeds, and so they are a conifer, but they are deciduous. So it is a unique tree in the conifer family. Last but not least, I wanted to talk about cedar. So this is eastern red cedar, or what we call eastern red cedar here in Iowa. Now, it is a little bit different. We look at these blue berries and we think, oh, those are berries. Those aren't cones. Well, actually, they are cones. They're a form of cone. And if you look at them closely, you can see that they are kind of bunched together clumps. So these blue cones are the reproductive part of a cedar. Now, cedars grow a lot of different places. Some people consider them weedy, but they're really, really important for wildlife here in Iowa, especially in central Iowa, because they provide shelter in the wintertime, and they also provide a food source, the berries. And that is why berries can be found in our ditches, in our fence lines, and places like that, because birds eat these, and then they fly, and they let them go back to nature, and then they regrow. So when we look at cones in different types of conifers, they really do vary a lot, from the large sugar pine cone, all the way to the cedar cones that we have here in Iowa. Now here in Iowa, we have 5 native species. 2 are fairly uncommon. They're low-growing shrubs, and they're not necessarily what we would think of as an evergreen tree. And that is the common juniper and the Canada yew. Those both grow up in the northern and eastern parts of our state. The other 3 species are a little bit more common here in Iowa. One is the balsam fir. It grows up in the northeast part of the state, and I showed you the seeds from that earlier. It's a beautiful little tree, but it really likes the topography up in the northern part of the state with the rocky outcroppings and well-drained soils. When we look at the other 2, white pines, we plant throughout the state of Iowa, as well as then the eastern red cedar, which is found throughout the state. To learn a little bit more, we're going to go outside and investigate some of the trees we have here at the Grimes Farm in the surrounding area, and I hope that you will enjoy learning about the different tree species. Okay, this is a kind of a unique tree we have planted out here at the Grimes Farm. It's not something we find commonly planted in the state of Iowa, but I thought it'd be a fun one to talk about because we probably have all heard about it. This is a ponderosa pine. So ponderosa pines get very large out in the west. They don't get so large here in Iowa because they need very specific soils, and they're kind of stressed out by the environment here in Iowa. For the most part, Iowa gets a lot of water and rain, and that can cause problems for our evergreens that are used to more arid situations. So this is a ponderosa pine. When we look at a ponderosa pine, we can identify it in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, because it's a pine, it has bundles, and when you pull off the bundles, that one has 2, this one has 3, 3, 3. So you'll notice that there's not a consistency. This one has 2. So if it has 2 to 3 needles in the bundles, then it is a ponderosa. That's a good identification of a ponderosa pine. Another good identification with the ponderosa pine is its cone. So its cone's a little bit larger than some of the other cones we have here in Iowa, but it has these really pokey points on it, obviously a way to help protect them from getting eaten from wildlife, but when you grab them, you cannot hold on to them tight because you would poke your hands. So when we look at a ponderosa, we find the pokey pine cones, say that 10 times fast, and then the needles that are either in groups of 2 or 3. Now, ponderosas, like I say, they're not native here. They're native to the western part of the United States. In fact, they're found in every state west of Nebraska to the Pacific Ocean. And they're also a very common lumber tree that they use out in the western part of the United States. So this is a ponderosa pine. So evergreens, to be honest, can be very hard to identify. This is a species that I was looking at, and I'm 75–80% sure that it is a red pine. The needles are too high up for me to grab. This is a branch that probably fell off during the derecho that I was going to use. But what I can do is, first and foremost, I look at the bundles. It's a pine. So I look and see that there are bundles, and those bundles have 2 in them. So I'm either looking at an Austria pine or a red pine. What you can do to identify the difference between those 2 is if you have fresh needles, you can take them and you can bend them. And if they bend and do not break, they are an Austria pine. If you bend them and they break, then it's a red pine. Because this isn't fresh, I'm not using this as an example because I'm not 100% sure. So my first instinct was that it was Austria, but then I found a pine cone, and the pine cone leads me to believe that it is more of a red pine. So when we're out identifying evergreen trees, you really need to use all parts of it to be able to make sure you're identifying the right kind of tree. So using the needles, using the cones, even the bark itself. Some trees are very easily identifiable by their bark. So this is a red pine. It grows in the northeast part of the United States. It has some health problems here in Iowa, so it isn't really encouraged to plant it here in Iowa. But it is a pine species, and it can be planted, but it has to be planted in the right location. Okay, One of our most commonly planted trees here in Iowa that's evergreen is the white pine, and it's the eastern white pine. We talked about it a little earlier that there is a western species, but this is the eastern white pine from the northern and eastern parts of the United States. They are found naturally in the northern part of Iowa, northeast part of Iowa, and then there is a couple of outliers, including one in Hardin County, where white pines grow naturally. They do pretty well in the state if you do plant them in other parts of the state. So naturally they aren't necessarily found here at the Grimes farm, but they grow quite well. When we look at a white pine, they have the long, flexible needles. They're pined, so they grow in bundles. So you can see that's a bundle that came off the branch. And they have 5 needles, and they're kind of a bluish green color. So those 5 needles, I remember it, white has 5 letters in it, so white pine has 5 needles. So that's a good identification factor. Along with their cones, they kind of have longer cones that curve just a little bit, and they usually produce these quite plentifully. So the white pines were very tall and straight. They were used for masts, like I said before, and we have them here in Iowa, and they're just a really great habitat tree for wildlife throughout the winter months. So this is an eastern white pine. So this is probably our most common evergreen we have here in the state of Iowa. It grows throughout the state on its own naturally, and this is the eastern red cedar. Now, cedar trees, some people think they're weeds, but they do provide great wildlife habitat, food and shelter. They grow a lot in the ditches and in in fence rows. The cedar is a little bit different when we look at the structure of the branching and the needles. They don't have needles like a pine that come in bundles. We actually say they have needles that grow in scales. So it's a little bit different form than the pine needles. Now, there is another species of cedar we'll talk about. It's the white cedar that we also have planted a lot here in Iowa, but it is not native. Now, when you grab the red cedar, it is kind of prickly, and that is another good defense that it has from being eaten from wildlife. And that's also another reason why it's a lot more common here in Iowa than some of our other evergreen species. Now, red cedar are rot resistant and they have very few diseases, so they're a great tree that if you want something that's pretty hardy and stable for the state. One thing you do need to take into consideration is that if you plant a cedar near apples, it can cause some disease problems, and so it's strongly suggested that if you have apple trees in your yard, not to plant the eastern red cedar with it. So, you know, we've heard of cedar chests and things like that. That comes from these trees. This is kind of a smaller tree, but they can get quite large and they can grow for a long period of time. And they're a really important evergreen that grows here in Iowa. So this is a fir. We don't have a lot of firs that grow well here in Iowa, but this is one species that does. So when you look at a fir, you can identify it when you pull a needle off of a branch. It's only one needle, so then we can cross out that it is not a pine because pine needles come off in bundles. Fir have flat needles, so when you try to spin it between your fingers, you can't. It doesn't flip around. So if you find a flat needle, it's a fir. Also, firs are soft to the touch, so when you grab them, run your hands over them, they don't poke you like a spruce does. So this is actually a concolor fir. It's also known as a Rocky Mountain fir. It has a beautiful bluish gray color to it. Firs, because they are soft to the touch, sometimes you have to worry about deer predation with them because they're easy for deer to munch on. But if you cage them and protect them, this species is good to grow here in Iowa and has not as many problems with disease as some others. They're a pretty big tree. They'll grow fairly tall and fairly wide, so you have to have a good space to put them in. Fir are a beautiful tree that again provide wildlife food and habitat. Their cones, like we talked about earlier, we looked around, couldn't find any cones on the grounds or any seeds because remember their cones break apart because they're a true fir. They don't have a cone that stays together. So this is a concolor fir. It also is known as a white fir as well, and it is a good tree species to grow here in Iowa. So this evergreen species is white cedar. We talked about red cedar previously, and this is actually white cedar. It's not native to Iowa. It is found up in the New England area and the northeast part of the United States. It again, also like the cedar, has lacy scale-like branches. So Pine needles, clumps, firs have flat needles. These have a scaly branch. Their pine cones are also very different. They actually, I think they look like little flowers. So they have little flower-like cones. I called them a pine cone, didn't I? They have little flower-like cones that hold the seeds. White cedar was used for pencils and things like that. It is a great tree that we put a lot of times in our windbreaks. It grows well here in Iowa. The one thing that this tree has going against it, though, is that deer love it. Deer love it when it's older. Deer love it when it's younger. It is like ice cream for deer. So it is something you have to take into consideration when you plant this tree, but it is a beautiful tree. It's great in windbreaks, grows well here in Iowa, and it's just a nice evergreen that we have growing here. Okay, so behind me I have a popular tree that's planted here in Iowa. This is a Colorado blue spruce. This tree has been planted a lot over the last 30 years or so here in Iowa. A lot of people love this bluish gray color, although it depends on the species. Sometimes they don't have this coloration. Sometimes they can be kind of a green color instead. Like the name says, it grows in the Rocky Mountains. It's not native here to Iowa. And actually, now we do not encourage people to plant this tree here in Iowa. It has a lot of disease problems, including needlecast disease, branch cankers, and really it's hard for this tree to grow here in the state of Iowa. We just get too much rain. So you can identify it's a spruce to start off with. So when we talk about spruces, we pull a needle off. Actually, I only got half there. Pull a needle off, and you'll see it rolls between my fingers. So unlike the fir, who has flat needles, spruce have square needles. So they're able to roll between your fingertips. So that's how you can identify a spruce. Another thing with the spruce is it is very pokey. It is painfully pokey when you get these trees. That is a benefit in the fact that the deer don't like to eat them because they are pokey. However, the Colorado blue spruce is not one you want to plant. There are some spruce species that are good to plant. And Joe Herring, the district forester for the state of Iowa, will be talking a little bit about that later in this video. So when I look at this, the spruce tree, spruces can be pretty hard to identify different species. They don't always have this beautiful blue color. They can really vary a lot in coloration. So when we look at spruces, the best way to be able to identify them is by their cone. So the Colorado blue spruce, they have a cone, and their cone, their little edges of their scales are quite jagged and rough. And so you can think of Rocky Mountains. This grows in the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains are jagged and rough. It's a blue spruce. So a cone is really a great way to be able to identify this spruce from other spruce species. And you're looking for that jagged scale that makes it a Colorado blue spruce. So this is a Norway spruce. For Iowa, this is probably one of the most climate-friendly spruces that grows in the state. Again, we can pick a needle, pull it off. They have shorter needles than the Colorado blue spruce, and that needle can roll in between my fingers, so I know that it is a spruce. It's kind of painful when you grab it, pointy ends. Now, when we look at a cone of a Norway spruce, they have larger cones. So we know size-wise it's larger, and they're not as jagged as the Colorado blue spruce. Colorado blue spruce cones can get larger, but because they don't have those jagged edge, we know that this is a Norway spruce. The name Norway spruce, it comes from Europe, and it's believed that it was probably brought here early in settling. A lot of people that would come over would bring plants of their native areas with them to transplant them and grow. We have this growing a lot in our towns. They can get quite large, but they're a great evergreen species that grows here in Iowa. And one of the things, if you can't get up close to this tree, lots of times they'll have like a tall trunk, and then there'll be branches up above. If you cannot reach and you're not 100% sure, you'll see that the Norway spruce's branches kind of have a dangling effect to them. They kind of hang down low, and so that's just kind of a natural growth pattern for a Norway spruce. Here is our third species of spruce tree that we are going to talk about today. This is white spruce. White spruce grows fairly well here in Iowa as well. It has needles that you would look at it and are somewhat hard to identify compared to the Norway. Again, spruce, so the needles roll between your fingers. But a good identification on this is that the cones of a white spruce are small. They don't get very large. They have smooth edges on each of the scales. So that's a good identification factor for this tree. Now, a lot of times we'll find Black Hill spruce. Let me try that again. A lot of times we'll find Black Hill spruce for sale in garden centers and places like that. Black Hill spruce is just a subspecies of white spruce. White spruce grows up in the northern part of North America. It grows in the northern part of Minnesota, New York, places like that. There's a small little crop of spruces, white spruces, that live in the Black Hills, and that is the Black Hill spruce. So those are all white spruce species, and they have those small cones that grow, so you can identify them with their small cones. So this evergreen is a Scotch pine. Again, we pull those needles off, we look, comes in bundles of 2. Their needles are about 2 to 3 inches long. It's kind of pokey to the touch. Scotch pine has been planted here in Iowa for a while. It does have trouble growing here in the state. And so it's not something that we really encourage people to plant. Scotch pine, like the name says, it grows in Scotland, but it's actually one of the most widespread evergreen species in the world. It grows in a lot of places naturally in the world. When we look at Scotch pine, we can identify by those 2 needles. We can also identify it because the bark tends to have a red-orange flaky color to it. Now these Scotch pines are not that old. As they get older, usually about by the age of 30 here in Iowa, they do succumb to disease. So these are younger trees. They'll be here for a little while, but then they'll pass away. So they grow fairly quickly. Now, a Scotch pine cone, when it falls off the tree, it falls off intact. What that means is that it falls off with the stem still attached. Lots of times when a pine cone or an evergreen tree or conifer cone falls off, it'll lose kind of the stem and then the base scales of the cone. So it's a good identification when we're looking at a tree and we find a cone on the ground. If it has that stem attached, Scotch pines are ones that do that. When we look up in the tree, we can actually see immature cones still attached to this cone, or still attached to this tree. And also another really interesting thing is that you can find the buds. So these are the buds for next year's growth for this tree, the winter buds on a Scotch pine. So this is a Scotch pine, one that grows here for a while in Iowa, but then oftentimes dies from diseases when it gets to be an older tree. So here's one of our exceptions to the rule. This is not an evergreen tree, obviously. It's lost its leaves for the winter, but it is a conifer, and this is the ginkgo. So ginkgos are very old trees. When they look at the ginkgo, they have found fossilized ginkgos back to when the dinosaurs roamed here, and they haven't hardly changed at all. And when you look at it, it does look a little prehistoric in the way its branches are formed and then its buds. Its leaf is very unique. There's not really any other tree that has a leaf like this. Remember, it's the females that produce the cone that have that smelly outside. They are pretty slow growing trees, but they have very few disease problems. They're pretty resistant to a lot of pests that a lot of our other trees are not. So ginkgo is an old tree. It is a deciduous conifer that grows here in Iowa, and it's a great tree to plant in your yard. One last tree I want to talk about is the European larch. We don't actually have one out here at the Grimes farm. We're going to work on getting one planted because it is a really beautiful tree. They are, again, a deciduous conifer. So they have cones like a conifer, but they lose their needles. However, they actually don't lose their needles until later in the year. So usually about November, they turn a beautiful golden color, and they have leaves that look like needles, just like evergreen needles. So lots of times people will see them in the fall and they think that their evergreen has died, but in all honesty, it's a larch tree and they just lose their needles every year and they regrow them. Native to Europe, and it's just an awesome tree that can grow in Iowa fairly well, and it just adds a little bit of color in the fall, and then it loses its needles and grows them again in the spring.
Hey everyone, I'm Joe Herring. I'm a district forester with the Iowa DNR, and today we're going to talk about selecting evergreens or conifers for your yard or windbreak or acreage. So we came to a cemetery to do this because oftentimes if you want to see what some of these evergreens will look like at maturity and full size, you can go to your local cemetery and get some really good examples. Just here in this local cemetery where we're standing, we've got examples of Norway spruce, eastern red cedar, white cedar or arborvitae, as well as eastern white pine. And these are very old trees, so it's a cool way to get a look at what they're going to look like over time and how far apart you might need to space them out on your particular acreage. So I've been a forester in central Iowa for 13 years, and we know that over the years Iowans have attempted to plant close to 20 or 30 different kinds of evergreens across our state. But as Emily described earlier, there's really only about 3 species that would have naturally occurred here. And so they've had the benefit of evolving for thousands of years in this region, in this climate, with all the different pests and diseases that they would be susceptible to. And so we kind of know at this point which ones really work well, and some of them are not even native ones that perform well here, but they've just proven themselves over time. So I've narrowed down the list that I would really suggest people looking at for planting in Iowa to about 6 species. And just to rattle them off real quick, they are eastern red cedar, which is this beautiful old tree that I'm standing next to here, Norway spruce, eastern white pine, concolor fir, arborvitae or white cedar, and most people will recommend a specific cultivar of that called the Techny, which is T-E-C-H-N-Y, and then finally white spruce. Now, oftentimes white spruce will be sold at garden centers as its western variant, which is Black Hills spruce, and it's okay to use in Iowa. We do see some slight disease issues on those Black Hills spruces and maybe even the white spruces, but generally, if they're spaced out far enough apart and they're planted in the right soils, they tend to do pretty well. So within those 6 recommended selections, there's a lot of wide variation in a lot of their characteristics and traits. So you'll want to take some time to kind of research through those choices and figure out which one's really going to work well for your particular situation. So for instance, the appearance itself can be pretty different on some of these different conifers. A lot of people don't really care for the appearance of the eastern red cedar. It kind of looks like a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. It's a little bit scraggly. You see it in ditches and pastures just coming up natural. But I personally love the way that it looks, and I know just how important it is for wildlife. It provides a habitat, winter protection, and food for a lot of different, not only birds, but insects, including monarchs, as they migrate through in the fall. We'll often use eastern red cedar trees. Saw-whet owls, which migrate through in the late summer, early fall, will also use eastern red cedar trees. So sometimes the other benefits of the trees outweigh just the appearances. The other thing about eastern red cedar that I really particularly love is it's very maintenance free. You can pretty much rely on it to grow about anywhere, whether your soil's a little bit wet, a little bit dry. As the old saying goes, it'll grow in a gravel road. So that gets to a couple of other things you should research, which are the local soil and sunlight and space demands that each of these trees have. So some of them are a little bit more fussy. For instance, the concolor fir and the eastern white pine will really kind of demand a really rich, fertile, and moist soil. They don't really want to tolerate kind of a yellow or brown clay that's poorly drained, which is kind of common on a lot of new housing developments. So make sure that your soil, you could go out and dig some small, shallow test holes and try to get down maybe 12 inches, 18 inches, which is usually where most of a tree's roots will occupy, and see what your soil's like, and maybe dump a bucket of water in that test hole, see how fast it drains out. That'll help you do a better job of selecting your tree. There's also some differences to think about in terms of deer preference. So deer in the wintertime often will feed on some of these needles, especially those that are soft and kind of delicate. So eastern white pine, concolor fir, and especially arborvitae are heavily preferred by deer. So if you got a lot of deer in your neighborhood or in the country where you live, you're going to need to cage those trees if you want to use them on your property or protect them somehow. Conversely, the trees that are more pokey and prickly, like the spruce, the eastern red cedar, which is another reason I like it, the deer don't tend to browse those unless it gets really dire in late winter and there's nothing else to eat. However, they will sometimes rub them or rake the antlers on the trunk and cause pretty severe damage. So beyond that, think about the size that those trees are going to be at maturity and how much space you're going to need. And again, coming to a local area like a cemetery or a park where you can see some of these is a good way of doing that. But just, for instance, eastern white pine and Norway spruce and concolor fir can get quite large, and you're going to need to have those spaced out 25 or 30 feet apart for them to attain full size at maturity. So do a little homework and narrow down that list a little bit. These conifers are just wonderful additions to Iowa's landscape for color, for wildlife habitat, for energy conservation and keeping your home warmer in the wintertime and stopping that wind. So they can do a lot of different duties. We just need to take our time and make sure we put the right tree in the right place, and you'll enjoy those trees for years to come.
I hope you enjoyed learning about evergreen species today out here at the Grimes Farm. If you have any questions about them, you can always reach out to us out here at the Nature Center. And if you want to plant an evergreen tree, think about what you want to plant. Make sure you do your research. And I hope you enjoyed this brown bag.